Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Graff, Chief Investment Officer at Facet. Today, we're going to do a deep dive on tariffs, what they are, what the impact on the economy might be, and then ultimately what the impact on the market might be. So let's unpack it. So what is a tariff? Tariff's really just a tax on any good that is imported. You can think of it like a toll that you pay as you go through a tunnel. A tariff is technically paid by whatever company is doing the importing, but because it raises the cost to the seller, they tend to pass some or all of that through to consumers in the form of higher prices. And this is why people worry that tariffs could be inflationary. Virtually all economists think tariffs are a bad idea in a vacuum. The idea is that countries should specialize in whatever it is they are best at producing relative to other countries. Economists call this comparative advantage. And the idea is if everybody specializes in a certain number of things, they'll get better at producing those things, become more efficient at producing those things, and then just trade with each other, and therefore winding up with a sort of a bigger global pie. This is pretty similar, if you think about it, to what you do personally. You've specialized in whatever it is you go off to do for work every day. I'm specializing in investment management. You can think of it as though that's what your household is exporting. So I'm exporting investment advice out in the world. You're exporting wherever it is that you've specialized in. When you come home, you don't try to make your own smartphone or make your own refrigerator or produce your own Netflix documentary. No, you import those things using the income you've gotten from whatever it is you've decided to specialize in. And, in this sense, countries aren't so different from you or me. So all that being said, that's the ideal world. We don't live in the ideal world. So in the imperfect world in which we do live, there are sort of two big arguments for when tariffs could make some sense. The first is a negotiating tactic, when certain countries might be interfering with free trade, maybe through government subsidies. China is a prominent example of this. There are many industries that China applies government funds to lower the cost of production, and by doing so, they may make their companies more competitive, not because they're actually better at producing a thing, but because of these government subsidies. And so a tariff could be a way of saying, like, hey, if you're going to cheat with your government subsidies, we're going to put a penalty on you in the form of this tariff when you bring that good into my country. Now, hopefully what's done here is turns into a negotiation. The country that is doing the subsidies and the country that is doing the tariffs, they get together, and maybe that helps us get closer to that ideal free trade world that I described in the beginning. Now, the other argument for tariffs is what's called protectionism. And this is where you may say, we have this industry, maybe it's not that competitive globally, but we're going to use tariffs or other protectionist tactics to prevent competition domestically and therefore allow the domestic company to succeed. This is, for instance, why we have so many airlines around the world. That's because a lot of countries would prefer to have a domestic airline, even if that airline isn't that competitive globally. And so they'll do various things to protect that airline from competition, at least enough such that that airline stays in business. Now, Trump has talked about protectionist type rhetoric, saying there's going to be a manufacturing renaissance due to his tariffs. But Biden came to similar conclusions about the semiconductor industry, for instance, when they passed the CHIPS Act, which has all kinds of protections and incentives to get the semiconductor industry going in the US. Some people will argue that if these kind of protectionist tariffs are done well, that maybe a company that isn't so globally competitive now can grow into being globally competitive in the future. And so many countries have tried this, and it has only worked a handful of times. And I think it's probably because when you protect a company from competition, they tend to focus less on innovating. And if your global competitors are innovating, then your domestic company is just falling further and further behind, and ironically, therefore, needing more and more protection to stay in business. Let's talk about what's actually being proposed here. President-elect Trump has talked about across the board tariffs of 20%, with special tariffs on China between 60 and 100%. So what might the impact of that be? Well, if you open up your economics textbook, it's going to tell you tariffs of that nature would cause economic growth to be weaker and consumer prices to be higher. There's some reasons to believe that the effect could be smaller in the US than it might be in another country. First, total trade in the US, that's imports plus exports, is only about 25% of our economy or of total GDP. That compares with an average of 63% globally. And it's one of the lowest levels really in the whole world and easily the lowest among wealthy countries. Then if we turn to consumer spending specifically, chart you see here shows that 2/3 of consumer spending is on housing and services, which really aren't traded across borders, while durable goods, which is the most commonly traded item, is only about 11% of consumer budgets. So even if there was a pretty large increase in the price of those items, it would only be so much of an increase in overall consumer prices. Now let's talk about the risks that this brings to the economy. So even if the effect is relatively small, that doesn't mean there's not going to be a material impact on markets. Already, the Federal Reserve is sort of starting to question how many rate cuts are appropriate. If you check out our video on the Fed we recently published, we showed that progress on inflation seems to be stalling around 2.6, 2.7, and could conceivably result in the Fed reconsidering rate hikes. I think that does create economic vulnerabilities. It certainly will impact the housing market. It definitely impact commercial real estate. And really anytime the Fed has to keep interest rates particularly high, going to increase recession risk, at least on the margins. So let's turn to that now. There's 3 things that we're doing that are related to tariffs. Now I'll say that none of them is tariffs the only reason why we would do them. Remember, we're sort of loath to invest strictly on political outcomes, which can be highly uncertain. So all 3 of these we're doing for other reasons as well, but they will be impacted by tariffs. Let's start with emerging market stocks. So we're underweight emerging market stocks, and emerging markets tend to need a lot of exports in order to keep growing. And so if there were to be just a general decline in trade activity globally, that would be pretty bad for emerging markets. Now, we don't invest in emerging markets debt at all in our portfolios currently, but that's an area that could be even more vulnerable than emerging market stocks. And so if you're in one of those funds, you might want to consider that. The second thing we're doing is we're underweight companies with high debt burdens. And so companies with a lot of debt are just more vulnerable to interest rates staying high or even going higher. I would particularly think about real estate here. And then lastly, speaking of interest rates, in our bond portfolios, we're underweight interest rate risk on particularly long-term bonds. So that means that if long-term interest rates were to keep rising, to be typical of a more inflationary environment, that risk can help protect capital in that scenario. So with all that being said, what do you think? Do you think the impact of tariffs is going to be larger than I'm describing, or if you think protecting domestic manufacturing makes more sense than what I'm arguing? Put something in the comment section. I'd be happy to answer any comments that I see there. And if you like this material, I'm going to be coming at you once a week roughly with information about the economy, about markets, any of this policy impact we'll try to react to as well as we can. So if you hit that subscribe button, you'll be the first to know when we've got a new video. We'd love to see you again.